So I bought this in 2016, and I do not regret it. It's a very interesting read, very thought-provoking, indeed. And it's interesting to see how the sentiments here have carried on over the years, in different forms, under different names, and with the same old hackneyed criticisms. I will be reading for you the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto. Now, I decided to read just the second chapter as it does bring up a lot of concerns that people may have about this. Although it isn't huge on strategy, as you will see, it kind of skips ahead, if so to speak. But I feel like it's good to kind of go through. So here we go, page 22 here in the authorized English translation, published by international publishers. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working-class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working-class parties by this only. In the national struggles of the proletarian of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. Now, I'm noting here that, if you didn't know, proletariat is essentially one who does not own capital, and bourgeoisie is, a kind of person who does own capital, which is used in business. And thus they profit from it. You can find out about that from the first chapter. You probably heard about it quite a lot. A lot of socialists and communists do tend to emphasize the sort of criticism a whole lot. So, back to the reading. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand, practically, the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. Now, I guess I'll have this in front of me. This is page 23, translation. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on the principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement as going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. Let me actually give myself a little space so I can put my elbow here. I'm actually holding up my phone here. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, or person's own labor. Mind that this is a 19th century work, and thus it has those sensibilities, just not feminist. That's kind of the way Europe has been, the West has been in that time without feminism. Largely, of course, wasn't the mainstream. Okay. Hard won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There's no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it, and is still destroying it daily. Or do you mean modern bourgeois private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., that kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon a condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property, in its present form, is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. Here we go to page 24 of the translation. Okay. To be a capitalist is to not only have a purely personal but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society, can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not a personal, it is a social power. When, therefore, capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e., that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. Now this kind of applies lately, actually, given statistics that show that most Americans cannot save more than $1,000, or even a few $100s, even $500. So they cannot save for an emergency, they cannot save for a jobless month, to look for a better job, and even then, looking for a job could definitely take more than a month. Sorry for the shaking, I get a little shaky when I, get into things like this. There's the internal conflict, of course, what am I reading, what in the world, of course, you listening might be feeling that as well. Okay, where was I? What therefore is... Okay. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom, and rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. Now we turn the page, and I move my camera a bit. That's better. Maybe I'll be a little less shaky with the slightly less beleaguered arm. The angle might be a bit odd, but it's gonna have to make do. I don't really have a camera that's like mounted like on a computer or something, so I'm just using my phone here. Okay, page 25. By freedom is meant, under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling and buying. Sound familiar? But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying, and all the other brave words of our bourgeoisie about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with restricted selling and buying, with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communist abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production, and of the bourgeoisie itself. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is only due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. Note that, again, this still holds true today in the 21st century. I don't know about the whole, top 10th, but I know that the top 5% of people own something like 70% of the capital. So if you extend that to 90 to the top 10%, you probably end up with 90% or maybe 88%, something like that, and thus doing away with property of the laborer, or even putting the laborer in debt. Negative property, one could say. Okay, back to it. You approach us, therefore, with intending to do away with the form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In a word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so, and this is just what we intend, or that is just what we intend. From the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent, into a social power capable of being monopolized, i.e., from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment, you say, individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois. Sorry if I'm kind of butchering the word. I'm not great at French, and not great at holding myself still. Oh well. You must therefore confess that by individual you mean you must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle-class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society, All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriation. I think my battery might be going low. It's okay. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to... Oh wait, no, I already said that. Yeah. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease, and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who, here we go, turning the page to page 26, who work, acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology. There can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. Okay. All objections urged against the communist mode of producing and appropriating material products have, in the same way, been urged against the communist modes of producing and appropriating intellectual products. Just as to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. You see that the parallels are not only economic but also cultural, and by cultural I really mean just like kind of the criticisms we hear even today. Let's see. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is, for the enormous majority, a mere training to act as a machine. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economic conditions of existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly is the case of ancient property. What you admit in the case of feudal property, you are, of course, forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie, but this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution. So I guess he was maybe a swerf, but then again, sex work would not be so much of a thing if work was so necessary. Okay, page 27. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But you will say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And this kind of goes into something that's later on that he advocates for public education, something that we already have, something that some say is destroying society, and well, the effects, I mean, it makes people literate. Is that destructive? Is it destructive to have critical thinking skills? To be better at memorizing things? Granted, it's not, a panacea or a panacea, but I hesitate to imagine how that could be a bad thing. And your education, reading again, is not that also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention of society, direct or indirect, by means of schools, etc.? The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education. They do but seek to alter the character of that intervention, and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hollowed co-relation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more by the action of modern industry. All family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. Indeed, we have gotten rid of slavery, largely, for most of society, most of the world, or a percentage of the world, but instruments of labor, that still remains. But so reading again, but you communists would introduce community of women, screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. Indeed, so this is kind of getting into feminism, so here we go. The bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and, naturally, can come to no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeois at the community of women, which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorial. Our bourgeois, not content with having the wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. I suppose that speaks to the Great Gatsby. Okay, page 28. I'm going to move over my hand again. Oh, that actually... Yeah, that was tiring. Okay. Page 28. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives, and in common, and thus, at the most, what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce, in substitution for a hypocritically concealed... Wait, okay, let me start this paragraph again. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common, and thus, at the most, what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce, in substitution for a hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, i.e. of prostitution, both public and private. Okay, let me check that, if I can see, can't see my battery, this Hopefully it will last. I have like 3 or 4 more pages. The communists are further approached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. Another thing that the left, the liberals, are being accused of. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got, since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation. It is, so far, itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonisms between people are vanishing gradually from day to day, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another is put an end to, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and, generally, from an ideological standpoint, are not deserving of serious examination. Does it require, from deep intuition, to comprehend that a man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? And now we go to page 29. Let me see, I think. Okay, it ends at page 31. So, here we go. I actually have this page folded because we're getting into some really meaty stuff. This is like going into going away, finishing the criticisms and going into the strategy, or somewhat abridged strategy. Okay, page 29. What else does the history of ideas prove than that the intellectual production changes in its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling class of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. When people speak of ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express the fact that within the old society the elements of a new one have been created, and that the dissolution of the old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old conditions of existence. When the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed to the 18th century, in the 18th century, to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religion, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive this change. There are, besides, eternal truths, such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. But communism, I figure I'll put on my Ben Shapiro voice, but communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality, instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. What does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms that assume different forms at different epochs. What does this accusation got past that. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages, vis-a-vis, I guess that's what it says, vis period, that's what it says. So, but whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages, vis-a-vis the exploitation of one part of society by the other. I think that was that. As it says, no wonder, then, that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety displays, moves within certain forms or general ideas which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involves the most radical rupture with traditionalist ideas. Well, I guess my phone couldn't record more than like half an hour or so. So, which is good because I had to charge the battery. Okay. I'm gonna just start from page 3 here, saying on my bed here. Okay, page 30. But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to establish democracy. Now, personally, and you probably have seen it as well, the idea of representative democracy tends to be rather unreliable, to say the least. So direct democracy with guidance, perhaps by elected officials, with guidance from certain, smarter people, maybe those who take the time to do the research and all that. I feel like that would be preferable than to like a representative system. Even the one suggested by Lenin, even that which is found in, say, Cuba, for example. I hear that's way more democratic than the United States. Anyways, caution with just having this sort of structure. That's why I'm a little iffy on Marx, but anyways, back to the reading. The proletariat will use all its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property, and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. So it seems like he does emphasize putting social revolution before political revolution, so to speak. So I think that would work. Yeah, seems viable. Can't have like a political system where people can just like buy out, like the bourgeoisie can just buy out politicians, or even buy out the interests of the people, with all this liberty and all that, and security and what have you. Okay. Alright. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. Now, I want you to pay attention because, as I kind of implied earlier, some of these are already in place. except for this one. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. This is number 1. Number 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Many countries have this. Some countries don't have it so much. 3. Abolition of all right of inheritance. Now this I feel like would work quite well, considering that apparently I got this from a tweet from I think it was Abdul El Sayed, a leader of the secular humanist group, I think, or I think it was something group of ex-Muslims. He pointed out that, and this is like, of course it's a secondary source or tertiary source, if it may be. He said that 60% of property is tied to inheritance. So this third step really would go a long way. 4. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Kind of goes without saying, if you leave your property, you can't exactly be on it. Oh man, this is kind of hurting my arm. Okay. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Now, this is actually something that's in effect with federal banks, central banks, although I hesitate to say that they're rather proletarian, kind of do their own thing. There's a whole IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and just all the machinations of that. 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Communication, not so much. It's regulated, but it is, telephones, phones are a utility, I think. Like, everyone deserves access to them, so they're regulated as such. Transport is definitely a centralized thing, although it is, centralized in local areas or states. Regions, if perhaps. Alright. 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. No, it means proletarian state, for whatever that word means. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8. Equal obligation of all to work. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Now this is that sort of, how's it go? Ability to give, what was it again? Like, you receive according to need, give according to ability, something like that. I forget the exact wording, but you've probably heard it before. 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Okay. And number 10 is something I mentioned before. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of child factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production, etc. Okay, so that last one's not so prevalent, but those first two, they are in effect. When in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared, and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Oh, by the way, page 31 started with 10, more or less. Political power, so properly called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away with the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms, and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. I guess if, sort of idea, like if everyone is equal, more or less, essentially, practically, as close as possible. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we will have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Thus ends the second chapter, and thus goes on with, just going on about sub-chapters, about literature, apparently. It's called Socialist and Communist Literature, I guess. Just little essays. So that's that.